Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where we, dive into weird, unusual albums here and there, look at all sorts of different music from all sorts of different kinds of people, So today I have what is actually a rather unusual artist, I would say. I'll introduce this review to you by letting you know that we're going to be going to church today. Yes, specifically we are visiting the Church of Noisy Goat, an incredibly strange yet delightful record label who indulge in pure experimental expression, pushing out albums of ambient, free improvisation, house, industrial, lo-fi, noise and post-rock. And today we're going to be listening to a sermon from one of the label's more prolific artists who's pushed out this incredible string of experimental releases under his own name. And so I welcome you to the strange world of Pete Swinton with his rather peculiar album, The Unbearable Absurdity of Being Pete Swinton. So today we're looking at, what I would argue is an electronic, non-vocal, autobiographical album of sorts. Very strange, but, very delightful in its own little weird way, right? But first, let's of course ask ourselves, who is Pete Swinton? Well, Pete Swinton is a half Hungarian, half Polish man born in London, UK, 1961. And having played guitar since the 70s, Swinton then moved on to keyboards in the 2000s. And what happened between those 30 years? Who knows? But what's even more peculiar is that Swinton then started releasing experimental works in around 2020. I think. Maybe a bit before then. Maybe way before then. I'm not too sure, to be perfectly honest. But since then, though, he has released this plethora of album releases across, a load of different record labels, under his own name, in various groups, and of course, countless collaborations, of course, right? And I have to say, since discovering, this very strange world of Pete Swinton through the Church of Noisy Goat, I have found his works to just be these incredibly peculiar and interesting listening experiences that always just pull you into this very peculiar little soundscape world, if that makes sense. It's interesting because Swinton, produces all these electronic albums, but they don't just seem to be, just simply electronic ambient albums, but rather just It's like he's rather just exploring every facet of the genre by just producing this endless array of different types of albums within the genre, if that makes sense, It's this incredibly peculiar body of work that just seems to be growing and growing with no end in sight. And I think there is something truly delightful about the fact. And so for today's episode, we are looking at The Unbearable Absurdity of Being Pete Swinton, which I have to say is a fantastic name for an album. This self-referential, almost meta look at his own self is a peculiar 3-track album of growing digital synthesized drones and experimentation. And Swinton's works, I would say it's a little bit hard to summarize, as each and every one tends to explore, a different concept or facet entirely, A bit later on, I'll go into sort of just how vast and different a bunch of these records are. And to be honest as well, I don't really know where exactly to start with Pete Swinton, as his experimentation just leads him down such strange and peculiar avenues, exploring the many facets of experimental electronic music that they're all rather different in their own right. But I figured starting with the self-referential album might be a good start, right? Maybe. I mean, I think there's something brilliant about the name as well, so let's dive into it then. And so, The Unbearable Absurdity of Being Pete Swinton opens up with The Unbearable Absurdity, 13 minutes of this rising arpeggiated synthesizer that just sizzles and bubbles underneath the surface, murmuring away as it gets backed up by these much longer droning notes and additional arpeggios. And for our introduction to this album, you're getting this wonderful hypnotic electronic landscape that pulls us right into the strange and unusual world of Pete Swinton, of course. And as the track pushes along, there's this wonderful rising sense to the whole composition as it bounces along with this really wonderful tempo, I must add. It's a perfect introduction to the strange world of this album, the unbearable absurdity of being Pete Swinton, and to the strange world of Pete Swinton's music as well, though, of course. And I think it's delightful. You'll see that all the tracks are essentially the name of the album split into 3 different names, of course. And starting with the unbearable absurdity makes logical sense, but there's something, just rather whimsical and absurd about the track itself in terms of how its progression and what it sounds like and stuff. It's a wonderful way to start off this whole album experience, I feel. And so following on from this rather bouncy introduction, we move on to the second track, Of Being, which opens up with this rather intense and dense sounding drone. Just hold down the note and let the music take effect as it fills you with this rising electronic tone. And as this one progresses, you're getting more elements starting to enter the scene. You get oscillating drones that twist and wind their way around the very dense opening drone before eventually you get reintroduced to those rising and falling arpeggios. And it becomes incredibly hypnotizing in its own right as you just end up drifting off to the lovely tones that this whole track is offering up. And this one pushes on consistently throughout the entire recording, but there's something just so delightful about this one. It's like, just let the synthesizer do its work and just climb up and down those various notes, and just pull you into that very surreal landscape, And on this one in particular, I find that backing drone, just to be really delightful. It's almost like I would say it's almost like a bulldozer, just pushing through the entire thing, It's almost like it's pulling up the earth behind it, and all it's doing is leaving behind these lovely, enjoyable drones for us to just listen to and get absorbed by, And then from there, we move on to the longest track on the album and the final track on the album, the self-named Pete Swinton, which is exactly 20 minutes of very peculiar experimentation. And so after the whimsical previous tracks, Pete Swinton comes across as a little bit of a surprise as, you're getting this very peculiar scratchy loop opening up the proceedings, before this very dark undulating drone just accompanies it, pushing it into the realms of surrealness. It becomes a very interesting yet rather foreboding landscape to traverse, and it's delightful to listen to, especially when you get that wonderful rising of deep rumbling bass notes, of course. But there is a change in this track, though. You've opened up with this really peculiar, almost unsettling landscape, but around 8 minutes in, this loop starts to introduce itself. It's a sort of, it's sort of a loop, sort of bouncing of what I think are chords. It starts to enter the scene, and it leads the composition into this entirely new direction, as though those peculiar loops, that started the whole thing, continue to just, remain present, if that makes sense. But what I like, though, the more you sort of get this little bouncy motif, though, the more it starts to drag the whole composition into something more optimistic, I would say, turning it from this rather dark foreboding track into this almost techno house style excursion of experimentation, maybe. But it's such a gradual shift, though, from the opening to the ending, though. But I think it's a lovely subtle shift nonetheless that has truly transformed the track from what it started as into something entirely different. And there is something rather dark and sinister about this particular track, I would argue, and with it being named after the artists themselves, I feel that this is perhaps the most referential piece, though. This is the one that Pete Swinton really wants to use to sort of express himself, if that makes sense. And according to the Bandcamp liner notes as well, this particular track does reflect a lot on the work of the composer as a whole. And so when you look at the incredible discography of Pete Swinton, you see a composer who has explored so many facets of experimental electronic music. And across these various albums, you've got albums of sweet, delightful drones, to dark, unsettling ambience, to experimental lowercase style, to these incredibly noisy experimental excursions. And as a result of all that, though, you can see many of the kinds of facets of this experimentation coming together cohesively in this composition, the self-named Pete Swinton, of course. And it results in this transformative track that takes us on this really weird and unsettling journey into this electronic delight that truly expresses the artist's intentions and ideas, basically. So perhaps it's this here that is the absurdity of Pete Swinton, though, an artist who's pushed out so many different kinds of albums and just letting his creative muse take him wherever he sees fit, and as a result, creating this incredibly vast and peculiar body of work that is really rather difficult to explain in mere words, I would say. There is definitely something, absurd and existential, about just consistently creating this kind of discography that's only just growing and growing, it seems. And with Swinton, releasing new albums on his own Bandcamp page as well, it just gets bigger and bigger, and you kind of wonder, what's he going to do next? What new direction is he going to take himself in? But what a peculiar journey it must have been to arrive at this very point in his own career, though, I have to say, And so, instead of trying to summarise such a discography and such a career, Pete Swinton has instead opted to offer us this self-referential album, essentially, this autobiography expressed to us as experimental electronic non-vocal music. And I think there's something truly wonderful about the strange world of Pete Swinton and the very album we're looking at, the unbearable absurdity of being Pete Swinton, which comes across as this very interesting introduction into this very strange, absurd world, no doubt. And it's one of those discographies where there's simply so much to discover and so much to enjoy, regardless of what kind of electronic music you enjoy, I would say, because it's like each and every discovery within this discography just tells us much more about this rather strange and enigmatic character. And so before we close off, I think it's actually worth mentioning a couple of other Pete Swinton albums then, just to get a kind of idea of the concepts he explores and the directions he generally takes things in, if that makes sense, and just how far-reaching the entire thing is becoming. And so, for examples, Dirty Factories, also released on Church and Noisy Goat, sees Pete Swinton offering us this very experimental album exploring atonal, black, sinister, and smoke soundscapes of old and dirty factories, with it featuring really murky electronic blips that are almost lowercase in style. And this is vastly contrasted by the very strange self-help album of How to Be Happy, which takes this his experimental approach and offers us this rather gentle cosmic drones that allow you to just truly just let go and drift off to, and just have a delightful time, if that makes sense. And then, of course, there's something like Obstruction, which I would argue has one of my absolute favourite album arts, not just amongst Pete Swinton's discographies, but amongst any discography. I think it's a truly brilliant album art, and this offers us a rather dark, murky electronic album that simmers away with these very peculiar little soundscapes before going into this very extended drone experimentation for the final 4 tracks. And just to continue, take the album Rusty Metal Days, for example, which was actually my introduction to the world of Pete Swinton, where you're getting these really dark, heavy metallic drones that are so dense that just push onwards into this very strange world of Pete Swinton, and yet the tones themselves are so satisfying to listen to. And I have to say, across this whole body of work, it's just a fascination with just pure sounds and how they can all express different concepts and ideas, purely through just how they're being presented, essentially. And what I find truly delightful about it all. It's just how Swinton seems to have been completely swept up by his own creative muse, and for the past couple of years has just completely ran with it, churning out this incredible discography of self-expression and experimentation, and never really adhering to, well, anything really, and instead just letting that creativity flow out and guide his music to wherever he sees fit. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our episode of Weird Music today. I'm really glad to have taken the chance to both talk about Pete Swinton and the label Church of Noisy Goat. I really enjoyed attending the various sermons that the church offers with its rather eclectic relay of releases. And I feel an important part of those releases and the very growing discography of Church Noisy Goat is the rather, eclectic, the rather ever-growing discography of the resident pastor Pete Swinton, of course. And I find this particular album to be a rather delightful, enigmatic little one. One that just sees this creates this very interesting soundscape that you can just get lost within for an hour or so. So yeah, we might dive into more of Swinton's works in future episodes. Maybe, perhaps. But I know we'll definitely be checking out some more records from the actual label itself, as there's some truly fascinating experimental albums here. And also, before I close out as well, I would like to extend a thanks to the owners of Church of Noisy Goat, owners Bode and IO, who, when I was researching stuff this album, finding which albums I wanted to talk about and stuff, they, apropos of nothing, just reached out to me to expend their thanks for my support to the label, apparently, which I thought, and then, it was lovely of them, and I thought it was very unnecessary, but truly sweet of them, so I'd like to offer back my thanks to them, basically. Truly lovely, wonderful people, no doubt, who have created this wonderful community for just people to experiment, express themselves however they see fit. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye bye for now. Bye bye.